Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So guys, we have a murder mystery on our hands. We have a real life murder mystery. So if you remember last year, Seth Rich, he was a DNC staffer. Seth Rich was murdered, I think it was at 4 in the morning. Now, 12 days after he was murdered, Wikileaks released all of this data, treasure trove of data, talking about the Podesta leaks and the cheating of Sanders. Now, at the farthest edges of belief, there was this idea that the DNC had Seth murdered for giving some kind of information over to Wikileaks or to some other agency. Now, like I said, this is not the prevailing thought. And ultimately, this was considered a conspiracy theory because, honestly, there's no information to back that up. There's a little bit of information now, at least potentially information now. So, a report comes out. Now, again, you need to take all this with a certain grain of salt because this report hasn't necessarily been proven. I mean, there was an investigator on the case, and that investigator kind of issued this bombshell report saying that there was a connection between Seth Rich and Wikileaks, making this assertion that Seth Rich was the one who essentially released those emails to Wikileaks, or at least a source, one of the sources. Now, this is Fox News. Rod Wheeler, a retired Washington homicide detective and Fox News contributor investigating the case on behalf of the Rich family, made the Wikileaks claim, which corroborated by federal investigators who spoke to Fox News. Wheeler made his comments on the possible Rich WikiLeaks connection in a story first reported Monday night. Now, the claim that we're talking about is that there was a connection between Rich and WikiLeaks. Now, an FBI forensic report of Rich's computer generated within 96 hours after Rich's murder showed he made contact with WikiLeaks through Gavin McFadden, a now deceased American investigative reporter, documentary filmmaker, and director of WikiLeaks, who was living in London at the time, the federal sources told Fox News. I have seen and read the emails between Seth Rich and WikiLeaks, the federal investigator told Fox News, confirming the McFadden connection. He said the emails are in possession of the FBI, while the stalled case is in the hands of the Washington Police Department. The revelation consistent with the findings of Wheeler, whose private investigation firm was hired by a third party on behalf of Rich's family to probe the case. My investigation up to this point shows there was some degree of email exchange between Seth Rich and WikiLeaks, Wheeler said. I do believe the answers to who murdered Seth Rich sits on the computer on a shelf at the DC Police or FBI headquarters. The federal investigator who requested anonymity said 44,053 emails and 17,761 attachments between the Democratic National Committee leaders spanning from January 2015 through late May 2016 were transferred from Rich to McFadden in May 21st. On July 22nd, just 12 days after Rich was killed, WikiLeaks published internal DNC emails that they did show the top party officials conspired to stop Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont from becoming the party's presidential nominee. The controversy resulted in Deborah Wasserman-Schultz resigning as DNC chair. WikiLeaks leader Julian Assange has stopped short of identifying Rich as the source of the emails, but has taken a keen interest in the case and has not denied working with Rich. There's more context. There's like a lot of layered context to this. So if you remember, after Rich was killed, WikiLeaks comes out and says, we're putting up $20,000 for any information to solve this particular case on how this person was killed. That's amazing. Why would WikiLeaks do that to just some random staffer who was murdered at 4 in the morning? So that's the first point. The second point is, I think I mentioned before, Julian Assange has asserted vigorously that it wasn't from Russia. Every time you've asked him, he's always said, I didn't get this from a state actor. Meaning, just intuitively, it had to come from somebody else. Now in this case, if it came from Rich, it completely guts this argument of Russia did it, Russia hacked us. If they can prove that, it completely guts the argument. Not just guts the argument, you must understand, Democrats, just run-of-the-mill Democrats, didn't understand how their candidate, this woman who was supposed to be just a foreign policy guru and the most experienced candidate in the history of candidates, they didn't understand how that woman could lose to reality show hosts. So it was easier for them to say, Yeah, there was some foreign intervention. She didn't lose on her own. She didn't lose on her own merits. She wasn't this horrible candidate in a dumpster fire of a party. Nope, that's not it. That's not it. It was Russia meddling. There's no reason why Hillary Clinton could lose. Huffington Post had her at 98%. There's no way she could have lost that election. There's no way. It had to have been Russia. Our illusions of the reality of what the Democratic Party is completely secured by asserting that it was Russia, not her or not the party. From the standpoint of the DNC themselves, not the run-of-the-mill Democrat, you can understand how Hillary Clinton would not necessarily want to have the conversation of how she lost to reality show hosts. That the DNC would not want to have the conversation of how they cheated Bernie Sanders in the primaries. Those are two conversations they desperately do not want to have. And so this idea of Russia meddling kind of helps them along. You get the run-of-the-mill Democrat believing it, and for the most part, you have some kind of argument to bulwark yourself against this idea of, yeah, she was just a horrible candidate that lost to reality shows. Now, more context. Is it true? Is it true? We don't know for certain that the information that's being brought out is true. It is Fox News after all. That being said, would I be shocked if it is true? No, I wouldn't be shocked. I trust Julian Assange on this point. If he's telling me it's not from Russia, I believe it's probably not from Russia, meaning it had to come from somebody else, internal to the process, unless somebody actually hacked them. It doesn't shock me one iota that Rich may have released this information. But you must be very clear and understand that there's a difference between knowing he released the information, erring on the side of, I think he released the information, and knowing for certain that he released the information. We have no certainty here. We have no certainty. This is something that came up. This was an investigator who put this out. The key point that you also need to understand is the investigator was a Fox News essentially contributor. The person who put him up for the investigation, the anonymous donor who paid for it, was also a Fox News donor. Or, let me see, what's the guy's name? So this is Snoops. NBC News identified the third party who hired Wheeler to investigate Rich's murder of Ed Potowski, a Dallas-based financial advisor who is also a Fox News contributor. Does Fox News have an interest in putting out this idea that the DNC had Seth murdered? Yes. Yes, they do have an interest in doing that. Meaning, because they have a bias in this case of, hey, the DNC murdered the guy. The DNC murdered the guy. Yeah, you should look at it with a certain amount of skepticism. The problem is, you're stuck with skepticism on both sides. You know the DNC is lying to you. You know the run-of-the-mill Democrat, for the most part, has an interest in not being honest about what took place. And Fox News wants to tar the Democratic Party. So yeah, if there's any hay to be made out of this idea of, hey, the DNC murdered a man with their bare hands, then yeah, they're going to make hay out of it. Fact is, they're taking people's word for it. You would need something a little bit more substantial before you can put down as the word of God that this took place. The story, however, is intriguing. Any way you want to look at it, the story is intriguing. And just as one other point, if it's determined that the story is right, if it's determined that Seth was in contact with Wikileaks, that is a mind-blowing phenomenon, or that's a mind-blowing thing that takes place. That's politically mind-blowing. You would also, if that's true, you're forced to take a look at the investigation itself to see if there was any kind of collusion between, if the DNC had anything to do with Rich's murder. Now, don't mistake me. I'm not saying that the DNC had Rich murdered. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying from the perspective of due diligence, you have to. I mean, you have to. If they come out and say, hey, there is information here showing that that Seth was in contact with WikiLeaks, and he just so happened to be murdered, you have to take that investigation with the potential that that murder had something to do with the DNC. Now, and for the last point, the family itself says Wheeler does not have authorization to speak for the family. So the family has been somewhat sheepish on this, and they've wanted to avoid sensationalizing the death of Rich. And you can understand that. Nobody wants a relative to be sensationalized and used as some kind of political gimmick. So, fair enough. But it's important to know that the family, for the most part, is not on board with what Wheeler is pushing. So, A spokesman for the Rich family on Tuesday said Wheeler was not authorized to speak for the family and called assertions Seth Rich sent emails to Wikileaks unsubstantiated. That's true. Just by definition, it is unsubstantiated. That doesn't mean it's false. That just means that they haven't proved it. Brad Baum said even if purported emails were to surface, it would not necessarily mean that Rich had helped Wikileaks. Even if tomorrow an email was found, it is not a high enough bar of evidence to prove any interaction, as emails can be altered, and we've seen that those interested in pushing conspiracies will stop at nothing to do so. We are a family who is committed to facts, not fake evidence that surfaces every few months to fill the void and distract law enforcement and the general public from finding Seth's murderers. That's fair. That's fair. And you'd imagine if you were the family, you would be aggravated as all hell if these conspiracy theories were popping up and there was no evidence to the conspiracy theories. From the perspective of the family, sink into their perspective for the moment. It's not so much that they are completely against this idea that it might have been the DNC. It's probably not even so much that they're against this idea of it being some kind of conspiracy in regards to the murder of Seth. I'd imagine, from the perspective of the family, your only priority is, I want to know what happened. I want to solve this particular murder mystery. I want to get justice for the person who died. So all these sensational claims of the DNC had him murdered, you can understand that that's going to fall like a sack of bricks in regards to the family itself. They don't care about the sensationalism. Some people involved in the process want the sensationalism, and they want to push this narrative that the DNC had something to do with killing this guy. The family is not in that perspective. The family is, I want to know what happened. I want to have justice. And I would imagine it is like nails on a chalkboard when every few months something comes up that says, the DNC had so-and-so murdered, when there's no smoking gun evidence to prove such. So take all of that with a grain of salt, meaning all of that is just context of the scenario. And just to bullet point it, it's possible Seth Rich was interacting with Wikileaks. What we do know is Seth Rich was killed at 4 a.m. They called it a burglary. It was mysterious circumstances. We know Wikileaks published a dossier of immense information showing corruption in the DNC and the fact that they cheated Sanders. We know 24 hours after the election, Hillary Clinton turned around and screamed Russia at the top of her lungs. There was nothing to corroborate it. She did it because she wanted to change the narrative. She didn't want to have this conversation of why she lost to reality show hosts. The DNC needed to cover this idea of cheating, and the party members itself needed to come up with some rationale to fulfill their illusions. Meaning, she didn't lose on her own merit, she lost because of meddling by a foreign government. That's all the information we have. This information is a bombshell to some degree if it's true, but we don't necessarily know if it's true. Stay tuned. Stay tuned. If this turns out to be true, that is mind-blowing. This Russia narrative goes out the window. If he turns out to be the leak, that is amazing. And the thing is, it makes sense. You know what I mean? Like, it's not a far-fetched thing that Seth Rich would be the leak. Particularly if you get over this narrative of, yeah, there's no evidence pointing to Russia in this. There's no evidence. Trump's ties with Russia, the Democrats have just as many ties with Russia. Why is it that Trump's ties all of a sudden held up to this particular standard, but the Democratic ties get a pass? If this becomes out to be true, man, that guts that narrative of Russia. It completely guts it. And ultimately, it says that the person who released the information was part of the organization itself, which also fulfills WikiLeaks' assertions that it wasn't Russia. Stay tuned. Stay tuned. Alright guys, if you enjoyed the content, feel free to share, like, subscribe, and you can always support the work through Patreon.